Quality, comfort, and grip at an affordable price. Whether it's our standard, pro, or elite socks, there's an option for everyone. Try a pair for yourself now at puregripsocks.com.
When it comes to football boots, we all have an all-time favorite. But is that because they were genuinely that good, or just because we associate them with good memories? Where there's absolutely no doubt that the 2014 Nike Mercurial Superfly 4 is one of the all-time greats and a favorite of many for very good reason. What it introduced to the world from a visual standpoint and from a tech standpoint genuinely had an impact on the entire industry. But 10 years later, do we just have fond memories of the Superfly 4, or is it genuinely that much better than what we have now, 6 generations later, in the Superfly 10? Let's compare and discuss whether or not Nike is genuinely moving forward with the Superfly concept or whether they peaked back in 2014. And really quickly, if you enjoy this 10 years later comparison concept, it's something new I'm trying, I thought it'd be pretty interesting. Drop a like on the video, that lets me know that you want to see more, and make sure you're subscribed to the channel if you haven't already so you don't miss out on my reviews of all the latest football boots of 2024. Where even though it has nothing to do with performance, I think it's worth talking about the price of these two football boots, especially given that price is always a controversial topic when discussing especially the latest products, because prices on everything have gone up. Inflation is a real thing, and in the case of the latest Mercurial Superfly 10 Elite, it's not cheap. It retails for $285, making it one of the most expensive football boots on the market, although not the most expensive. However, you do also have the option of the Vapor 16 Elite, which is the same boot minus the collar at $260. So you can theoretically get the same fit, feel, and overall performance characteristics for at least a little bit less than these. Whereas back in 2014, the Nike Mercurial Superfly 4 retailed for $275, just $10 less than the current model. However, given that that is 10 years ago, adjusted for inflation at 33%, these would have actually cost $366. But because the Superfly 4 was so cool looking and so hyped up, nobody really complained about the price tag. When it comes to touch on the ball, if you don't like where the Mercurial is currently at, you have the Superfly 4 to blame, being that it was the first full Flyknit Mercurial model, Flyknit being a relatively new technology to the world of football boots 10 years ago, with the Superfly 4, and of course the original Magista Obra being the first two to really roll out this technology. And as far as what you got with the Superfly 4, it was pretty straightforward. It's Flyknit across the entire foot, relatively flat, relatively thin, Nike Skin top layer of thin polyurethane on the surface that made for a little bit of additional grip, but nothing overly sticky, Brio cables or flywire cables, just thicker flywire for the sake of added structure running from the base of the sole into the lacing system, and then of course Nike's ACC technology. Pair that up with a mid-cut collar that people were super hyped about at the time, and the end result was definitely a football boot that felt very sock-like, but also one that was super thin and fairly raw, giving you that premium barefoot feel, but with a level of softness that I don't think we had ever really felt before in a pair of Mercurials. A Flyknit upper that I do think still holds up pretty well today. However, there have been plenty of other brands, including Nike themselves, that have produced thin knitted uppers that just feel more special than this does. It was amazing and groundbreaking for the time, but by today's standards, I'd say relatively unexceptional. Where 6 generations later, you're still going to find Flyknit as a key component of the Superfly in the collar as well as the area across the top of the foot. However, the main section of the upper is made from their grip knit material, something that's new to this latest generation, with another form of knit in the form of Atom knit, making up the lower part of the midfoot as well as the heel area for structure, as well as a little bit of additional weight savings, where of course these are all pretty well variations of Nike's Flyknit technology in that they're all sock-like knitted uppers. However, with grip knit, it is of course the appeal of that sticky finish that you have on the surface, almost like a soft silicone type texture that legitimately does provide additional grip on the ball, where in comparison to the Superfly 4, I think this is softer, it's more pliable, it's a little bit thinner, and despite not having the Brio cables as added reinforcement, the material itself, just due to the advancement of this knitted technology from Nike, as well as some differences in the liner, make this feel every bit as responsive, and I would argue more comfortable than what the Superfly 4 has on offer. Where obviously if you're not a fan of having that extra grip, you might prefer the feel of the Superfly 4, but I do think objectively when you're comparing one knitted upper to the next, what they have in the current model is just that much better. Or at the very least is technically more impressive. From a design perspective, something that is pretty interesting about comparing two Superflies 10 years apart is the height of the mid-cut collar, because if you remember correctly, when the Superfly 4 first came out, obviously Cristiano Ronaldo was going to be the main face of that football boot, and he very controversially had a custom pair with a significantly lower customized collar. Eventually he would transition into a normal one, but as you can see, side by side, the new Superfly has a much lower collar than the original, which definitely had the highest one of the bunch. None of this, of course, translates into better or worse performance, and neither of them provide any form of ankle support unless you like to imagine that it does, but it's an interesting thing to note nonetheless. When it comes to sole plate technology, again, these two football boots could not be more different from each other. Where the Superfly 4, of course, featured a carbon fiber sole plate, what would also end up being the final carbon sole plate from Nike, given that the next generation Superfly 5 and Vapor 11 would feature an anatomically shaped plastic one that definitely wasn't as cool looking, but I would argue was more responsive and certainly felt better, not to mention was also lighter than what this was. What I will say about Nike's carbon fiber sole plates, whether it's the Superfly 4 or really any of the ones that they produced over 7 years, is that it's incredibly cool looking. This, I think, was part of the justification for a lot of people in spending the $275 on a pair of football boots all the way back in 2014, and there's no doubt that it does feel good. Having said that, it also feels fairly unexceptional, especially by modern speed boot standards, in that it is perfectly flat. It isn't really all that responsive. You do run the risk of overall durability, being that Nike's carbon sole plates did pretty frequently crack through the midfoot area. Granted, I think they definitely worked out a lot of the kinks by the time the Superfly 4 came around versus the carbon sole plates that they were putting out back in 2007, but for all of the extra costs and I suppose risk of durability issues with this carbon fiber sole plate, the upside in terms of feel and performance definitely wasn't there. It's still a good sole plate, don't get me wrong, but if it didn't look as cool as it does, I'm not sure people would look back on it with such fond memories. Where comparatively, and let me know your opinion on this, I would agree in saying that I don't think the new Superfly 10 sole plate looks anywhere near as premium as the carbon one on the Superfly 4, but when it comes to feel and overall performance characteristics, it's lighter, it's more responsive, it's arguably more solid in a lot of ways through most areas of the foot, and the incorporation of that 3/4 length zoom unit I think just feels so incredibly special. It for me is one of the greatest new technologies in the world of football boots, which I suppose in a lot of ways does relate it back to the Superfly 4, which was so groundbreaking for its mid-cut Flyknit construction. But I really do think, despite the way that it looks, when you're talking about sole plate tech, the Superfly 10 blows the Superfly 4 out of the water. And then when it comes to traction, I've always found it hard to criticize Nike's Mercurial stud patterns throughout the years because they've made tons of changes, but they've all performed extremely well. I would make the argument that the new one does offer more aggressive traction. The chevron bladed studs, funnily enough, were pretty well what they introduced in the boots that replaced the Superfly 4 with the Superfly 5 and Vapor 11, which again, I think goes down as one of the most aggressive stud patterns they have ever put out. The same remains true with this latest model, given the design similarities, but I don't necessarily think the straight blades that you have on this particular boot with a little bit of a chevron stud on the lateral side isn't also super aggressive and doesn't also perform extremely well on firm natural grass. Where out of all the elements we've compared so far, when it comes to traction, this is the one area where I think personal preference is going to be a factor in terms of which one you think actually feels and performs better. And then there's the weight, where again, after 10 years, especially when you're talking about a pair of speed boots, I think the progression you would expect is that the new one is lighter than the old one. We'll see if that's actually the case. Technically not the same size though. The new ones are a 9.5 US, the Superfly 4s are a 9 US. However, they are actually very similar to each other in terms of length. We'll throw them on the scale though, because that never lies, starting with the Superfly 4, and you can see that they weigh in at 7 ounces exactly, the equivalent of 198 grams, meaning that they are still very lightweight by today's standards. Change the scale back to ounces, and we'll throw on the Superfly 10, and you can see that they weigh in at 6.75 ounces, the equivalent of 191 grams. In other words, between these two pairs, there's only a weight difference of 7 grams, which is relatively insignificant, and I suppose accounting for the sizing difference, where if the Superfly 4 was half a size bigger, let's say there's a 10 gram weight difference, which for 10 years of evolution, really not that significant. Something that always surprises me when I go back and try on a pair of football boots that I have such fond memories of is very often they just don't feel anywhere near as good as I remember. However, in the case of the Superfly 4, it feels very familiar. There's nothing about the overall shaping that I think feels outdated. It's definitely a little bit slimmer in profile and volume when compared to the latest Mercurial, also because I think the grip knit upper of the new Mercurial is just that little bit more pliable, and the shaping maybe feels slightly more refined in terms of how it contours your foot all the way through. However, the thing that really stands out to me between these two is the sole plate just feels significantly better with that Air Zoom tech on the Superfly 10 compared to the 4, which just feels very normal despite looking as cool as it does, being made out of carbon fiber. But it's really the fit through the heel that I think is the major difference and one of the big evolutions we've seen in football boots since the Superfly 4, which is really one of the first to introduce this kind of mid-cut sock design, where something that was a huge issue for a lot of people when these first came out, and we pretty much all overlooked it because we loved the idea of it, is that there was rubbing and sometimes even blisters in the back of the heel around the Achilles tendon area, basically where the structure of the heel counter ended and the collar started. In the case of the new Superfly and really most mid-cut football boots, instead of being constructed like a mid-cut boot, they're built like a low cut, and then they just add the collar kind of around the edges, which makes for a much more comfortable fit, not just at the back of your heel, but also in terms of overall lockdown and just general shaping. I think the shape of the Superfly 4 in comparison feels very straight up and down, where the heel counter and heel design of the Superfly 10 really feels like it's grabbing my heel, holding it in place, and doing so in a way that is overall just much more comfortable. So for me, comfort and quality of fit is going to be the big difference between these two, where again, I think it's tough to say that the Superfly 4 is quite as comfortable as the newer Superfly 10. It's not that you couldn't wear them, I just don't think they feel quite as good. So, in conclusion, there is absolutely no question that the Superfly 4 is still a really solid pair of football boots. From a fit perspective, it's great. From a touch perspective, it's still really solid. The feel of the sole plate and the performance of the stud pattern is still top notch, and they fall into a very similar weight range as many current model top end speed boots, where I think these do fall behind a little bit in comparison to the latest model is in regards to overall comfort, where I just think early variations of mid-cut football boots in general that we were getting in the 2014 to 2016 timeframe just aren't as comfortable as what we have now, in that they were designed as mid-cut boots with a collar, rather than the current crop of mid-cut boots being more so a low-cut design where they just add an extension that inevitably just ends up feeling way more comfortable. Where the blisters, or at least discomfort, that a lot of people would get on their Achilles tendon with the Superfly 4, while still possible with the latest model, just aren't as common. Where the Superfly 10, just like the Superfly 4 was 10 years ago, really represents kind of the best of what Nike has on offer from a tech perspective. Grip knit material, Air Zoom technology, a lightweight construction, an incredibly comfortable and responsive fit that you expect out of a top-end speed boot with super aggressive traction. This, for me, is one of the best performing football boots on the market, just as the Superfly 4 was back in its day. However, side by side, head to head, which one do I believe is better? It's the new over the old.